Perhaps you've seen the signs around town. They are everywhere. Be somebody. You seen these? Hashtag be somebody. Keep your eyes out. They're all over Marietta, especially around the square. It's the new publicity campaign by Marietta High School. Hashtag be somebody. The Blue Devils. The irony is thick. Embedded in this seemingly innocuous hashtag is the norm of vanity, vainglory, which is pride turned in on one's own public perception. It seems normal to say things like this to children. Hey kid, be somebody. And we forget that Jesus said almost exactly the opposite. Hey you, somebody, if you do not become like a little child, you're not getting in. We teach our children to hate that which God loves, which is their humility, their self-forgetfulness, their unimpressiveness. Be somebody. We fill them with vain thoughts. Be somebody. And then they are consumed with vanity. Our subject today is the deadly sin of vanity. We get there through our appointed text from 2 Samuel 18, the story of the death of Absalom, who died when his beautiful hair was caught by a tree. Vanity is truly a deadly sin, and our world is dying from it. Vainglory, or vanity, has started most of the modern wars. Vanity fuels the over $500 billion cosmetic industry. Vanity fuels our politics, our automotive industry, our fashion, career paths, and, as we see around Marietta Square, our educational philosophy. So we're going to examine this text from 2 Samuel 18 according to the fourfold sense: the literal, the typological, the moral, and the anagogical. You can find the outline so you can take notes on page 16, and you can find the text that we're going to examine on pages 7 and 8. First, the literal. Let me give you the background. Absalom was one of the sons of David. He had 3 sons. He was one of them. He was a beautiful man, and this led him to the deadly sin of vanity. Listen to what 2 Samuel 14 says. Now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair, was heavy on him, he cut it. And when the hair was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed his hair. 200 shekels of the king's weight was the weight of his hair. I feel like when we read the Bible, it happened so long ago. It's in other cultures. We often lose our normal sense of assessing people according to like weird things. Nobody weighs their hair. Nobody does that. It's like the meme, like no one, Absalom, like. Absalom was so enraptured with himself that he cut his hair only once per year. He wanted to be known as the guy with that great head of hair. And if that wasn't enough, he sought out a supplemental factoid that he could share with the ladies at the gate. Hey, baby, this mop weighs 200 shekels. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so don't miss the weirdness of his vanity. He was that guy. He weighs his hair, that guy. This is the form of vanity that focuses itself on physical appearance. But vanity actually has another element to it, and that is a pining after notoriety or significance, approval, or fame. Hashtag be somebody. Absalom had this too. In chapter 15 it says, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. That is quite an entourage. And Absalom used to rise up early in the morning and stand by the way of the gate. Keep in mind, he had no authority to function as he did. Whenever a man would come into the village, he'd say, hey, you, what city are you from? He'd say, I'm from so-and-so city. And he said, what you doing in Jerusalem? And they'd say, this is what I'm here to do. And he'd say, oh, that idiot dad of mine, he doesn't have a man to hear your complaint. He did. Tell it to me. And he stood by the way of the gate. And then they would tell them their complaint, and he would say, oh, I'm so sorry. And it says in the text, and he would take their hand and kiss them. He'd kiss all the men of Israel on the cheek or on the hand and say, oh, I'm here for you. Thus Absalom did to all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. He made himself into somebody, I'll tell you. So we have this man overcome by this vice of vanity in both of its effects, its fixation on physical appearance and a panting after the world's approval and significance. As the story goes, Absalom, so full of himself and having stolen the hearts of the men of Israel, decides to rise up against his father, King David, and he stages a coup. But Absalom, the pretty boy, is no match for David, this man of war. And so David quickly gathers his armies, splits them up into 3 battalions, and attacks Absalom's troops at the woods of Ephraim. David, though, gives instructions that Absalom is not to be harmed. He loves his son. He wants to have him back. He wants to reconcile. The battle at the woods of Ephraim goes very badly for Absalom and his army. They fled the battle into the forest that was next to Ephraim. And the text says there that the woods devoured more than the sword that day. In the battle, Absalom was riding his mule. That's what kings rode. He wasn't the king, but he was riding a king's mule. And he rode the king's mule into the forest at Ephraim. And as he was riding, his beautiful hair, did you know, by the way, that it was 200 shekels? His 200 shekel weighted hair was flowing gallantly behind him as he fled David, and it caught on a limb. That would hurt. But his hair was so strong that it didn't tear, and he hung there by his hair. So he's hanging from this tree by his hair that he loved so very, very much. And the text says that Absalom, it says this, was suspended between heaven and earth. Weird way to say that. Could have said hung by a tree. It says intentionally, he was suspended between heaven and earth. The kingly mule ran away, signifying that Absalom was being dethroned. So one of David's generals, Joab, finds Absalom, and he takes 3 darts and stabs Absalom through the heart. When David hears the news of his son's death, he cries out in the famous tragic words, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee." We'll get to that later. "Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Before we move on to the typological, take note of 2 things. The first is the irony of Absalom's death. It was his hair, the root of his vanity, that killed him. Take note of the irony. Vanity is a deadly sin. Next, note the heart of David, his father. Though Absalom had murdered one of his brothers, David's son, though he had tried to kill his father, tried to steal the kingdom, David continued to love his son. He never once desired the death of a sinner, but rather that he would turn from his wickedness and live. So let's move to the typological sense. So many of the elements of this story serve as types. Absalom serves as a type of the person overcome with vice. That's us. But for the grace of God go we. But inasmuch as we are touched by vice, we are Absalom in this story. We are the vain sons and daughters, the vain beloved sons and daughters of the King. Jesus is the new David. He loves us. He weeps for us when we are overcome. He desires not the death of a sinner, but rather that he would turn from his wickedness and live. Joab, the general who stabbed Absalom through the heart with the 3 darts, is a type of Satan who cannot wait to slay you. Perhaps this week you can think about the typological meaning of the 3 darts. What are those? Send me an email with your best guesses. I don't know. I thought about it for a while. I thought I'd just crowdsource it. So, calling a lifeline to the crowd. We speak of sin as deadly. You're familiar with the deadly sins? All right, I think I saw a few people nod. Are you familiar with the deadly sins? Heard that phrase? We speak of them as deadly because sin can overcome and take us. The branch, it says in John 15, that does not bear fruit is severed from the vine and thrown into the fire. It was attached to the vine. It did not bear fruit. It's severed and thrown into the fire. What prevents the bearing of fruit more than an invasive vine or a disease? That's what sin does. Sin grows up and around the vine, the branch of our soul. It grows up in our affections, our heart, and then it manifests and shoots out wicked fruit in our habits, in our decisions. Soon we're measuring the weight of our hair. It's a slippery slope, folks. But we're overcome by it. It chokes out our faith. It chokes out the love of God. Originally, vanity or vainglory was listed as one of the 8 deadly sins. There used to be 8. Lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, envy, wrath, pride, and vainglory. But 8, it's so close to 7, and 7 such a great number, that Pope Gregory in the 6th century took pride and vainglory and he combined them. And now it's 7, and all is right with the world. We, like Absalom, are tempted by these vices. If we give in to them, they can consume us. Many, many people come to ironic ends, like Absalom. We often think of them as mere coincidences, but they're not. Absalom died by his hair. It was ironic. The lustful die of STDs. The gluttonous die of obesity. But not to make light of it, but it's just ironic. The greedy die of stress. The slothful die of poverty. The envious die of treachery. The wrathful die by the sword, by violence. And the vainglorious person dies as he is, empty, alone, with no weight to his life, able to be suspended between heaven and earth. Vice is deadly. Satan is vicious. Punishment is ironic. And Jesus longs still for those overcome with vice to return. He weeps over every sinner that dies an ironic death. So let's move to the moral sense. And for this, I'd like to zoom in on vainglory or vanity. As I said before, vainglory has two elements that are related to each other. The first is a fixation on physical beauty and how one appears to others. We often call this kind of vainglory vanity. We fixate on the car that we drive, what kind of phone we have, how much we weigh, whether we have a six-pack or a one-pack. Both men and women fixate on the size and shape of their homes, the kind of clothes they wear. And of course, vanity is clearly seen in our curation of social media avatars. But I would be remiss if I did not reference what we see in our text. Vanity is often seen in a fixation on hair. Hair. I'm going to talk about hair for just a little bit. It is amazing how many advertisements I get for hair regrowth. What? I feel like the CCTV cameras from up high are talking with the advertisers. Yoo-hoo! See that guy? You know what to do. I've lost track of how many of you have talked to me about my hair. One parishioner, about a month ago, asked me if they could buy me a toupee. No. Just in case the rest of you were wondering, the answer is no. I don't want no toupee. This fixation on hair is not particular to our culture. Hair has always been the seat of vanity. This is why the Bible ties Absalom's vanity to his hair. It is also why St. Paul talks a lot about hair in the epistles. He says, women should adorn themselves in a respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly attire, but adorn themselves with good works. In 1 Corinthians 11, he has a whole chapter devoted to men's and women's hair. In short, neither men or women were to use their hair to glorify themselves, vanity, in the presence of God. It is the tendency to attach glory to hair that motivated the monks to take on the tonsure. If you're not familiar with the tonsure, it's basically like an inverted bowl cut. Think about that. It's what I'm going for, by the way. Almost there. It was a way of ensuring that their beauty, their glory, would be on the inside and not the outside. No monk would ever be caught hanging from the oaks of Ephraim. They got ahead of Satan. If your hand causes you to sin, what are you to do? What about your hair? Enough about hair. Have we talked enough about hair? All right, let's move on. Vainglory has another element besides outer appearance. It's this yearning for significance and notoriety. Hashtag be somebody. We must recognize that the air that we breathe, the water that we swim in, is vanity. So many things push our minds from the humble present moment to the glorious future. We abhor the humility of the present moment because the present moment is always so small. The future is as big as our vanity can make it, but you can only milk from the present an insignificant amount. So our vanity keeps our eyes on what we will become. Like those trees on the hill from a couple weeks ago, I will become this or that. This daydreaming, this vanity keeps us from prayer. What does prayer do for my vanity? We scroll our Pinterest boards when there are neighbors that we have never met, never hosted inside these beautifully decorated homes. We forego taking walks with our children It's unimpressive. We forego calling our elderly relatives because what do they contribute really to your image? We forego making great meals on nights that we don't host because if a tree falls in the forest, did it really fall? It did. God sees all. He sees when you bless your children at night when they go to bed, even though you get no social capital of it. The sacrament of the present moment is what Jesus is talking about in the gospel today with the Good Samaritan. The people that passed by this man had something in their future that loomed larger than the significance of the present moment. We say often that everything you need to become a saint is where? It's right in front of you. Satan lives in the future. God owns the present. Lewis talks about this in Screwtape Letters. Stay in the present. Everything you need to become a saint is right there. Vanity keeps you in the future. I want to recall an element of the story that we haven't touched upon. Vanity suspends us between heaven and earth. We see this in Absalom. It detaches us from the grounding of that present moment. Vanity detaches us from the ground, the soil of this present humble moment. The soil comes from the root humus. If you're not attached to the present, the soil, the humus of the ground, you will never grow humble. And you will never grow into that tree which is meant to reach heaven. The seed that is suspended between heaven and earth cannot grow. In our own vainglorious imaginations about what life could be if we were somebody, or the plans that we make to make our life great, we are like Absalom, suspended neither in the present, but only in the future. Now, if I lost you there, let me make it real simple. I'm going to remind you of a theme that has been given through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Everything you need to become a saint is right in front of you. People frequently want something else, a different path or future. That's what we talked about a couple weeks ago. This week we look at the soul who wants to be a better version of themselves. But everything you need to become a saint is right in front of you. Hashtag, be nobody. Be a nobody. Blessed are they who live hidden lives, seen only by God. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are they who never forsake their prayers. Praying the daily office is how we ground ourselves in the present moment. Neglecting it is the doorway to vanity. When you feel yourself drifting into dreaming about the future, ask God to steer you back to the present moment and to give you some opportunity to serve humbly. Send a text to someone that's forgotten, or write a silly poem for your children. Pray for someone in affliction, or plan a feast with your neighbors that you've never gotten to know. Blessed are the unimpressive homes that are filled with hospitality. As it becomes easier and cheaper to look like a Barbie or a Ken, it should become also easier to spot a Christ follower visually. Think about that. As it becomes more and more compromising to become successful in this world, to be a somebody in the world's eyes, then the church that emerges over the next 50 years should be full of nobodies, unsuccessful people, unimpressive people, candles reserved only for God, doorkeepers in the house of the Lord, men and women who have no commendation except, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." What will it look like for Christ the King to swim upstream in a torrent of vanity? To close, let us turn our attention to the anagogical. As we strive to imitate the humility of Christ, let us draw comfort from his final work on our behalf. He is not just like the David who weeps for his vain children. Jesus went further. Was it not Jesus Christ who was suspended from a tree between heaven and earth? David says, "Oh, that I would die for thee, O Absalom." Did not Christ allow his hair to be pulled out, hung from a tree, naked? Was it not Christ who spat on all external glamour and public adulation? He died for us, the vain Absaloms of the world, that we could be forgiven and freed from our vainglory. So, beloved, come, let us enjoy our humble feast. To the world, this feast is very unimpressive. But what do we care about what the world thinks? We have Christ. We need nothing else. Amen.